So what if you could implement change, major change within your capital project and maintain, like I said, all the governance, the compliance, maintain your schedule on that capital project? What if? It's possible, and we know because we've done it. We're a Docanish & Company. We believe in excellence in project services, and we've been delivering world-class project controls, system implementation, and project management, and organizational change management across some of the biggest mega projects in North America and the Middle East. And today we're excited because it's the first installation of a content series where we're going to be unpacking our organizational transformation platform that Omar is leading that we call Docanish Navigator. So watch this space for more events, more content that's published on our approach and frameworks that have worked in the real world. And without further ado, I'll move along. Today's session, we're going to cover 4 items that we hope you'll learn. One is how technical issues often mask or masquerade as deeper challenges within management and these projects. Number 2 is real examples of a cost multiplier effect in regulated environments. And number 3, practical frameworks for managing which called change saturation in complex projects. And then number 4, finally, early warning signs that can predict project delays months in advance. Omar will talk about some of that and what's worked for us in the past. Let me just admit a few more people. Excellent. So the webinar itself is specifically designed for project leaders and executives who need to deliver complex transformations while maintaining operational excellence. These folks are under the listeners are under a lot of pressure to deliver. And so that's our focus, is putting ourselves in your shoes. You'll walk away with the 4 items I mentioned and then practical approaches to identify, measure, manage change impact in high stakes environments. So without further ado, allow me to introduce our expert, our change leader, my colleague, Omar Kaoud. He's the Director of Organizational Change Management here at Docanish. He leads all of our client engagements involving adoption of change driven by strategic management objectives. He brings more than 10 years of experience managing complex change across a variety of initiatives and all levels of management. He's worked with clients across many industries, including finance, higher education, energy, nuclear, professional associations. And also he has a recent master's degree in adult and higher education from the University of Toronto, which plays a significant role in his approach and strategy. And Omar, thank you.
Thank you, Nate. I want to compliment you on saying my last name pretty well. So thank you for nailing that in the very generous introduction as well. I often fall below the bar when I try to self-introduce myself. Thank you for taking that on and doing a great job with it.
You imagine my last name is Habermeyer. So yeah, I have the same problem. So I know. Anyways, welcome, Omar. Thank you. Over to you.
Thank you, Nate. I guess where I'd like to start before we descend into capital projects, regulatory compliance, and change management is just to level set on the words and the definitions we're going to use. Organizational change management is the discipline to bring a workforce from a current state to a future state. And that's like the standardized definition of organizational change management. So all the tools and techniques that you use to journey people from where they are today to where you want to get them in the future. I'd like to contrast that with project change management. I know the two sound almost identical. I'd like to make the distinction because the two are often confused, whereas project change management is concerned with what's the proper way of managing changes to scope, cost, schedule? Organizational change management is concerned with how do we get people to transition to a new state. I will throughout this webinar be using change management. I know I'm being naughty and I shouldn't do it, but it's just easier to say change management instead of organizational change management. It's just a little bit of a mouthful.
Yeah.
So yeah. I think the other two items that I'd probably like to just touch on before we start is what do we mean by change? I know change can be a fairly comprehensive term. So I'll define it in the way that I'm going to be using it today is a change can be any shift away from a technology, a new process, new procedures. It could be regulatory changes. It can be any sort of departure from the norm is what we would be talking about when we say change. Of course, there is complexity and there's nuance to the different types of changes out there. And we'll talk a little bit more about that when we dive into the crux of this webinar. And I probably, given the audience, I don't have to go into too much detail about capital project, what we mean when we say a capital project. But just for the sake of folks that may not be too familiar with that, capital projects would be any sort of large scale, long-term investor that undertakes like significant expenditure of financial resource.
Yeah.
Right. So we're talking about like hundreds of millions, billions of dollars budget. And a lot of the times they're centered around some sort of physical asset, like refurbishing a nuclear power plant, building buildings, mining, all those sort of things are
Bridges,
sort of
highways, yeah,
highways, yeah, all that type
power
of
plants.
infrastructure is the realm with what we're talking about when we talk about capital projects.
Right. So can we differentiate and talk about just where delays come from? What are delays? Are they technical? Are they people challenges? Let's address that up front. What's that? What are the delays?
Yeah, when we're looking at capital projects, particularly ones in regulated industries, the sort of delays that I think we are, uh, I would say, conditioned to see are what I would say technical ones. So that could be something like, oh, like the system that we just implemented isn't working, it's buggy. Or it could be disagreements about, oh, what's the proper way to do risk? Or so those sort of things masquerade as technical issues when in reality those are primarily people issues. And just from observations that I've made throughout my career, there's I think a fair bit of delays and cost overruns that are tied back to people rather than the technical. 60%, I would say, of delays that I've noticed tend to tie back to people issues.
People issues.
And I think the implication here is how people on capital projects allocate budget for organizational change management. I think the typical range is anywhere between 1 and 6% of the budget. But I think, and those are just like the cold, hard stats. From my own experience, my own observations, it tends to be a lot lower than 1%.
That's not a lot.
No, it's not, especially when you consider when you don't allocate the adequate budget for it, those people issues end up cropping up later down the road where it becomes more expensive to deal with them than if you had addressed it from the onset. So there's certainly hidden costs associated with not addressing it up front.
Okay. What makes capital projects different than, I don't know, could you differentiate between like various types of projects and mostly operations? Like how do capital projects, how are they different than say operations or normal day to day?
Yeah, I think what I indicated earlier on, it starts, I think, from just the character of capital projects being their size and complexity. So again, typically 100 million, $1 billion CapEx budgets, thousands of like people working on a given project, lots of process and technology to support that endeavor, I think is probably the one thing that the first and foremost probably that separates a capital project from like an IT project, for example, is size and complexity. The other layer is the regulatory complexity. When you think about, let's say, in the nuclear industry, you have the CNSC, Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission. In the US, you have the Environmental Protection Agency. And what makes it unique for capital projects is the additional layers of stakeholders that get put onto your projects. If you like contrast that with, let's say, operations, which is a very like routine type of thing. You're repeating the same sort of activity day in and day out with not much variation. Whereas on a project, by definition, it is a unique endeavor. And with that comes the complexities of uncertainty, addressing lots of different stakeholders, and the regulatory environment applies an additional layer of complexity because there is compliance, there's regulation changes. And so that is what kind of complicates the capital projects from that perspective. I would say the last sort of element or dimension that separates it is for capital projects, you're running a project while the organization is still keeping the lights on and doing the other things that it does.
Kind of building
So
the ship, sailing it at the same time, so to speak.
exactly. I was
Yeah.
going to give a different one, like fixing the car while it's moving. But yeah, you're right. That's
I'm very
exactly
naval oriented, so yeah,
it.
we'll go with Navy.
Yeah, exactly. So that's exactly it, is like building the ship while you're in the sea or fixing the ship while you're. So it's difficult. There's a lot of complexity involved in being able to keep the lights on while you're trying to implement a transformational change.
So now let's take the shipbuilding analogy. Let's put ourselves in the shoes of some of our attendees, directors, executives that are running these capital projects, large or small, where change is occurring. What sort of warning signs should I, as the director, the executive, the leader of this capital project, be looking for?
Yeah, so I will preface that just with one thing, just an observation that I think is pertinent to this is I think in the capital project space, the acknowledgement of organizational change management is very much at its infancy.
Hmm.
I am starting to notice more and more organizations starting to pay attention to it. I'll just give a quick anecdote. I attended an AACE event last week in Calgary.
Yep.
Actually, it was one that you recommended I go to. So it was a great session. And the presenters were from TransAlta, their energy generation company. And they were talking about how they needed to adapt their risk processes to be able to better account for uncertainties in the renewable technology industry. How do they manage their supply chain better? How do they account for changes in pricing? What was interesting, though, was one of their initiatives was to shift when they do their risk analysis to an earlier gate, an earlier stage of the project. And credit to TransAlta, they readily recognized that they were getting resistance, not because of a technical issue. They said people were having difficulty adopting this new paradigm that we wanted to implement. And I think it's slowly starting to get there. And it was a very refreshing sign to see that there was mention of organizational change, managing resistance. It's certainly out there, but like I said, I still think we're at our infancy.
It sounds like one of those warning signs is people.
For sure, absolutely. So yeah, thanks for keeping me
I'm
on
bringing it
track,
back.
Nate.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you, Nate. I appreciate it.
It was a good anecdote. We'll talk about some of the warning signs that I can look out for.
Yeah, for sure, absolutely. I'd like folks to like take away just the three warning signs. There are a lot of warning signs, but I think it's often helpful to leave away with fewer and you remember them as opposed to giving you a laundry list of things and you can't remember any of them. There's three that I'll touch upon here. The first one is change saturation, and I'll explain each of these in more depth. Leadership and just resistance in projects.
Mm.
So we'll start with change saturation. If you're a project leader or an executive, one thing for you to orient your focus on is how much change is going on within the organization.
Mm,
If there's too much change going on, then your likelihood of success starts to decrease
decrease.
because you can't inundate people with too much change because they have work that they need to do, they have things that need to get done, but also there is a sense of exhaustion that sets in where people feel like this is just too much. I just don't know what's happening. I don't know the direction we're going in. So that's a really key one to keep in mind is how many other transformations or changes are happening in the organization at the moment that you're planning or considering to implement a change.
Mm,
And I recognize that this is probably challenging because a lot of organizations that I've seen don't tend to have a centralized change management office. So what that looks like is maybe IT is looking to implement a new system. Maybe they're implementing a new ticketing system that's going to hit the organization across all departments. And HR is also implementing, let's say, a new benefits tracking system so that people can go in and see what their benefits are and whatnot. And on top of that, maybe there's a regulatory change. Maybe the way the organization is reporting on their ESG, for example, changes. And now you're an executive and you're like, I'm running this $1 billion nuclear refurbishment project, and I need to implement a cost management system in order to support this. You like part of being able to make that analysis is recognizing that there are all these other changes that are happening, and how are those puzzle pieces going to fit together in relation to the change that I want to
yeah,
implement.
that's right. Yep.
Uh, the next one is a leadership. In a lot of the literature, there's a very consistent finding that leadership is one of the main success factors when it comes to successful change.
Mm,
And that is one of the ways that they characterize good leadership is being active, being visible on the project that you want to implement. There is a recognition that in order for projects to succeed, you need to have strong leadership that demonstrate their commitment to the change.
right.
If you kind of contrast that with a more passive type of leadership where maybe they're not attending like town hall meetings to give people updates on the progress, or they're not always available for decision making, that can obviously have a very substantial delay on the velocity of the project and timelines. Um, and without going descending too much into the leadership dimension of things, because it is a very
We could
complex
spend all
thing.
day talking about it. Yeah.
Absolutely.
There's
Yeah,
another
absolutely.
there's another webinar for the leadership bit. Okay.
Exactly.
Yeah, we'll leave it there.
Exactly. So having strong leadership, and sometimes that means looking at your own leadership style to recognize, okay, am I being active? Am I
Mm,
demonstrating my commitment to it? But it could also be you evaluating the leadership. Maybe you're not the leader, maybe somebody else is. So that's the second warning sign that I would say is if do you have weak leadership? Are they not committed to the change? So that would be the second one. The third one, I'll term it as just resistance. So,
this is an interesting one. And we've written about it on our blog and published some insights on this topic.
and I think the topic of resistance can sometimes be shrouded in a bit of mysticism. I'd like to describe resistance in kind of two ways. There's like the more explicit forms of it versus the more implicit forms. It is sometimes a little bit tricky to pick out the implicit. So I'll start with the explicit.
Okay, yeah,
Explicit is
thing.
somebody just telling me like, hey, I'm not going to use this new tool that you're asking me to use, or I'm not going to adopt this new gating and sanctioning governance procedure, for example. That tends to be rare, in large part because generally people don't want to come across as difficult or unwieldy. That one is, in my experience, has been primarily rooted in personality. There's some personalities that are defiant, they're not shy to express their disapproval. That one's easy to pick out because it's right in your face. The more difficult one are the implicit ones. And that looks like people saying, oh, I don't have enough time, or this doesn't really make sense. Why are we doing this
A
change?
little more
Or
subversive, a little more.
exactly,
Yep.
subversive,
Yep.
yep, and more subtle. A lot of it can be an expression of just pessimism. Oh, this is never going to work out. This, yeah. So that one is a little bit trickier, and it ties back to what we talked about earlier about that technical versus the people. People may express that, oh, this change isn't going to work because the technology you picked just sucks. You know what I mean? And so it seems like what they're telling you is, oh, there's a technology issue, but you have to peel back the layer a bit to figure out that actually maybe this person is just saying that because they're afraid they may lose their job. They're
Right.
afraid that they may not be able to adopt this new technology. So that's that explicit implicit dichotomy. So if you're noticing people telling you like, oh, this is never going to work,
Yep.
or people expressing pessimism about the future, that's definitely a warning sign of something for you to keep in mind. The last sort of element that I'll touch upon when it comes to resistance is of a more cultural nature. So, the way that a culture can operate within an organization tends to follow a pattern. One way I like to position this is, how does an organization respond under stress or under
Okay.
crisis? Okay. Do they close ranks and like back each other up? Do they isolate and just stay within their silo? Is there strong management that all people follow their dictates? So that pattern of behavior, I think, is important to keep in the back of your mind, because when you think, okay, I want to implement this new cost management system, for example, what is the current prevailing culture at my organization? Is it one that is conducive for change? They embrace change? Or is it an organization that tends to be a little bit apprehensive and reluctant when it comes to considering change? That I think is an important, if you have a culture where there is a persistence of negativity around adopting change, then that is also to a warning sign that I think is important to kind of heed. It doesn't mean you don't do the change. It means you need to think about the approach that you're going to take in order to navigate that warning sign.
Yeah. So just for the audience, I appreciate you guys hanging in there, listening to some of Omar's insights. We're going to pivot now to some of that practical sort of what do you do? How can you address? Which is, we went through some of our dry runs in Pride. Like, this is some pretty interesting, pragmatic frameworks, approaches that I think people will really value. And I just wanted to give everyone listening a heads up that that's sort of where we're going with this webinar at this point in time. So you've talked about the warning signs. We've kept them simple, and they're not really that simple. They're actually quite complex. But what are some practical ways now that I, as a leader, can use to address, assess, and then address the pushback on change?
Yeah, I'll approach this in two ways. I think you've set the stage for it. So one is just being able to recognize or at least assess a change. Okay, I think that's a key feature, that a key takeaway that I'd like folks to take home with. The other point that I'll touch on is, what are some ways to start integrating it in your own workplace? So I'll start with a really practical framework to use to assess change. And the value of doing this is that it'll help you gain an appreciation for the resourcing and the support you'll need in order to make your change or your transformation successful.
Hmm.
So there's three things that you can use to assess change. There's much other things. There's a lot more than just three, but again, I've cherry picked these three because they will compel you to ask more questions. So the first one is change complexity. What is the complexity of the change that you're planning to undertake? So you can distill that into three categories roughly: people, process, and technology. you can ask yourself, okay, the change that I'm planning to implement, what is the impact it's going to have on process? And we talk about process, we mean like procedures, the way things are done.
Stuff on paper, ways that we advance
Exactly.
certain things and information. Sure, sure.
Exactly. That's right. Yeah, things on paper, the way, yeah, things are advanced. How much of a change are we going to do to that process?
Mm,
Okay. So let's say I will just going back to my TransAlta example, they were changing fundamentally when and how they were going to do risk assessment. So that necessarily entails a change to process. And you can think about like how significant is that change to the process? Are we throwing the old process out the door and creating a totally new one? Or are we kind of making some slight modifications to it? So there's degrees to it. So you can have a very significant process change, or you can have a minor one.
mm,
Again, it's a way for you to just think about the complexity in that way. Next one is technology. Are we going to be introducing a new technology? How significantly different is that new technology to what people are used to today? Or is it just an upgrade to an existing technology? All the interfaces are going to stay the same. There's just some back-end stuff that are going to change. Again, it's on a spectrum, it's on a continuum from very small technology change to very high. And the third one is people. What is the training? What is the knowledge gap that people are going to need to close in order to be able to adopt that new future state? And that is often addressed through training, upskilling people so that they know how to use, let's say, a new cost management system. Or in the case of TransAlta, it may be about training them on how to approach risk management in a different way. So that kind of touches upon the change complexity. So evaluating what is the complexity of the change using those three people, process, technology dimensions.
mm.
The next one is competing priorities. So this touches upon the change saturation. This would entail doing a scan across the organization to understand, okay, what else is happening in the organization that may also be conflicting with what I want to do.
Both
So
short and long term. Both short and term.
exactly.
Yep.
Yeah. You want to look at it from those two time dimensions. And so that would entail like reaching across the aisle, maybe to somebody in IT. It may be going to somebody in HR just to get a pulse and get an understanding of, hey, are there any significant changes that the organization is planning to undertake? So that would be a second dimension that I would have folks kind of contemplate when they're trying to assess change. The last one is just the sheer number of stakeholders that are going to be impacted. So if we're talking about, again, the example from TransAlta, maybe the group of people that are responsible for doing this new risk approach, maybe it's only a handful of people. Okay. So that might be considered a small lift. Okay. In contrast, if we think about, let's say, implementing a new cost system on a project, that may be that may hit a whole bunch of people. And so again, you need to think about the complexity when and look at it through how many stakeholders are being impacted. Now, to make it easy, an easier way to be able to use this is how many departments are being impacted. And that can give you a pretty quick and rough scale of the number of stakeholders. It won't be precise, but I think what I'm aiming for with these three dimensions that I'm talking about is something that you can almost do in your head, or maybe you can write it down and figure it out. But yeah, it's just supposed to be a quick way to be able to look at a given change and assess like, okay, how much support and how much resourcing am I going to need in order to be able to make this change successful? So that's
Hmm.
evaluating the complexity of the change, understanding any competing priorities within the organization, and lastly, how many people are going to be impacted by this change.
Thanks, Omar. So, with sort of those frameworks in mind, what does then integrating change management into project management look like? on your capital projects? On these, our listeners have a variety, of course, like large and small capital projects. What does that integration look like?
Yeah. This I always try to be judicious about the sort of advice I dispense. I don't want to give overly lofty and ambitious advice that people go back and be like, this is just not feasible. What I like is to start small and then work up from there. So I
Okay.
think the first and foremost thing that I would encourage people to do is just simply ask the one question: how is this change going to impact people? Okay. And it can be in your meetings. Maybe it's at the point in the project where you're still evaluating options. Okay. Just having that in your mind and thinking about the people dimension of things. How is we're going to be refurbishing a nuclear power plant? Okay. What are the people considerations that we should think about? I think just starting from there and asking that question, I think is a really good starting point. It doesn't take much. You don't have to you don't have to revamp any procedures or anything like that. As an individual contributor, just asking the question will cascade into more questions, and it'll help get the conversation started. Now, moving on to the more
Lofty,
ambitious, yeah,
ambitious.
lofty,
Okay.
yes,
Yep. That's okay.
is including it as part of your governance. When I think about, let's say, your PMO sort of governance, include organizational change management as one of those facets that your project managers need to consider.
Hmm.
That will, I think, be a very helpful way to get people more involved in thinking about it, is having it as part of the governance. Now, the other option that you can do is when a project is going through its gating and sanctioning process, when a project is looking to secure its funding for the next phase of its project, that is also a really good time to be asking those types of questions. What are you said that part of your nuclear refurbishment plan, you're required to have a new cost management system, for example. Okay, have you considered the resourcing that you're going to need in order to support your workforce adopting this new cost management system? So that, I think, is a really good entry point to be asking that question, so that it's part of the planning, it's part of the budgeting.
So this may be a silly question to follow up with,
Mhm.
but I think it's important because if you can't measure it, then it's not worth being done, perhaps.
Yeah.
How do you measure, how do you know that change management efforts, because it's not as easy as some people think, but how do you measure that your efforts have been translating into positive outcomes?
Yeah. So I think I'll answer that in three ways. So I think the first one is, what are the conversations looking like about change?
Mm,
Okay. Are they constructive? Okay. Are people engaged? Are they asking probative questions? Are they involved? Those, to me, that is a good sign. I know perhaps there may be a perception out there that really good organizational change means that nobody resists or nobody raises any objections. And I'd like to push back on that conception. I think that good organizational change should have people pushing back or at least raising issues, because
mm,
that tells you that they're engaged and that they care about what's
that's right.
happening.
Yep.
I think constructive conversations about the change is one really good. That one's obviously a more qualitative yardstick
Measure.
that you can
Yep.
use, a measure to use to see whether or not your change is going. The other one is benefits realization. So what I think is not, it is very important, is at the outset of your project is to really clearly articulate and define what it is that you're hoping to achieve at the end of the project. And it quantitative is ideal, but even a qualitative description is also important as well. And the reason why I think it's important to be able to define those at the beginning is, once you get to the end of the project, after going through all the work of requirements and testing and all that sort of stuff, you need to be able to look back and see, okay, what was I hoping to get out of this whole endeavor?
Mm.
And am I there? I go back to the TransAlta example. If I'm implementing this new way of doing risk assessments because I'm trying to lessen the exposure I have to, let's say, market fluctuations in commodity prices, have I achieved that? That's a very quantifiable metric. So I think that becomes important, is being able to define qualitatively and quantitatively what are the outcomes you're expecting to see by the end.
Got it.
And that will give you a barometer. That'll tell you like, yeah, I'm trending in the right direction, or I'm falling short of what I had initially expected. The last one is just if you're seeing a change in a pattern of behavior. So whatever was the pattern or the norm today is now changing and transforming to the new norm that you wanted people to. So that may be people are asking the right questions about what they need to do. I think maybe just a more solid example is again going to, let's say, the cost management. The pattern of behavior may be that before people weren't utilizing any single system, people weren't asking the right questions about how to calculate their cost or how to manage their costs. But now, with your efforts in steering people towards better practices, people are asking the right questions. People are showing initiative and demonstrating that they actually care about having precise cost calculations. And so a change in the pattern of behavior towards the target is another way that you can tell that the change effort is going in the right direction.
So at the beginning of our session together, we proposed a question. What if you could implement major change while maintaining all of the compliance, the governance, maintaining your schedule for your project, not falling behind? What are some of the main takeaway points that you want our audience to think about as they depart?
Yeah, so I think the first one would be a recognition that organizational change is an important part of your capital project. There are hidden costs that get masqueraded as technical issues when in reality they're people issues. The three warning signs that the change that you want to embark on is risky. Change saturation, there's too much change happening at once, weak leadership, and resistance of the implicit and the explicit type. So people expressing pessimism about the initiative, giving excuses about not having enough time. Those are the three warning signs. Being able to establish sort of a framework for being able to assess and implement organizational change in your organization is just first being able to evaluate change. So its complexity. So how complex is that change? The number of stakeholders that are impacted and the number of competing priorities that are in flight. And the other element of that framework is being able to find the opportunities to ask the question, how does this impact people? And that can be during the gating and sanctioning process of your project. It could be integrating it into the governance procedures of your organization's PMO, or it can just be as simple as just asking the question in a group setting, how is this going to impact people?
Excellent. Uh, all right, thank you. So now we're gonna shift gears and we're gonna go in the Q&A. I've got a few questions that have come through already, and I'll dive right in. What has been your most important facet of change initiatives that proved successful?
For me, I, I think it's the human touch, the human
Mm.
element of things. I think, especially in the sort of capital projects world where you engage with a lot of folks that are highly analytical. Their focus is primarily on building things. They're analytical in nature. And sometimes we tend to forget that we're working with human beings that have feelings, emotions, dreams, aspirations. And so, from my experience, being able to connect with people as people and helping them along the journey has been probably the most important facet and proven successful, because people want to feel positive about themselves, and helping them transition through a change is not easy. And showing the empathy and support that they need, I think has been one of the more successful techniques for me.
After you've trained teams, after a product launch and start to measure adoption, but notice limited traction or success, what are some tactics you would recommend? So this is sounds like a real world issue.
Yeah, it's a really great question. I like that question for a lot of reasons. One of them is because implicit in it is another one of those kind of misconceptions that I'd like to address first,
Okay.
and then I'll answer the question. There is a tendency for people to view training as like a panacea. It's going to solve everything. And I think the better way to understand training is that training is there to help people acquire a skill. Okay.
Hmm.
It's it's certainly an important dimension in adoption, because if you don't know how to operate something, then you won't be able to adopt it. So it's certainly fair from that perspective. But what I've noticed, particularly, I think, when it comes to project management and the adoption of, let's say, project management tools, for example, like a RACI chart or stakeholder register, I think people sometimes conflate training with behavior.
Hmm.
And what I mean by that is, like, training is meant to help you acquire a new skill, but there's also the other part of adopting things is your behavior. So just if you will allow me to,
I
I'll use
will,
an
of course.
example.
Yes, please.
Let's say you're someone that wants to lose a few pounds, for example, and you know how to make a meal plan, which foods to eat, and you are like, you have all the knowledge you need in order to lose those few pounds. But for some reason, whenever you drive by a gas station, you go and you pick up a chocolate bar. There's no amount of training and education that's going to solve that problem. That's a behavioral problem. And I think that can sometimes get lost when we're talking about training. So
Hmm.
now I'll answer the question directly.
What
So,
tactics do you recommend?
exactly, yeah. I would say the first thing that I would do is I would actually interview my end users and understand what precisely is the issue. Okay. Where is that lack of adoption coming from? And here, this is like that implicit, explicit sort of dichotomy I mentioned earlier. You really have to listen to what people are saying. Are they telling you, like, oh, this system is not user friendly? That might be a coded way of saying, hey, man, I don't like the system. You know what
Yep.
I mean? So
Yep.
it's important to be able to extract the behavioral cues from those interviews in order then to inform you on what you need to do. The other part that I would do, and I know this is not a popular thing to do because it can involve some risk to reputation, which is maybe you need to reevaluate the product. Is it the right solution? And I'm now leaning on my experience with IT projects, is sometimes there are IT solutions looking for a solution, if that makes sense. Not
Yep.
like, sometimes you don't need a fancy IT solution to fix a problem in your organization. Sometimes it just needs a human touch. So I would also reevaluate, did we come up with a good business case? Is it the right solution for the issue that we're trying to resolve? So those would be the tactics that I would use, interviewing end users to figure out the behavioral roots, and also to reevaluate whether the product is the right product.
Right. With implicit change resistance, how do you get staff to understand that they may not be privy to all the factors why this change was decided upon? I guess it builds on your example with the IT, the systems, and thinking about it, but a little bit different. Sometimes there needs to be a trust factor in upper management. How do we improve this?
Yeah, so I think this is leans on the leadership element of things. It's I know that there is often a desire to want to know every sort of nuance and detail about why there was an executive decision made on a particular strategy or a particular change. So I think what becomes important is how leadership kind of forms and constructs the narrative they tell their staff. And this is, I think, a bit of an art form rather than a science in the sense that there isn't like a scripted playbook that I can give somebody to be like, yep, just follow these steps and it's not like an algorithm. There's a bit of judgment that needs to be applied to say, is wording the message appropriate this way? How is it going to land with my audience? And so I think the first part of that is just, okay, how am I constructing the narrative about why we're doing this change? I think the other part of it is actually, like I indicated earlier, is actually just talking with people,
Yeah.
understanding where they're coming from, trying to be empathetic and mirror what their grievances may be, which isn't to say that you are beholden to those, because sometimes people may have reservations about things that are not rational or don't support the organization. And the tough reality of it is if the organization needs to make a change that you feel is not conducive for you or you don't like it, there is to some extent support that we can provide,
Hmm.
but we can't do it at the expense of the organization, or else why are we all here then? That's how I would approach that.
So thank you, Omar, so much for your insights and pragmatism and a bit of lofty recommendations. I think that's always good for more information and more content, more series, more sessions. We'll be publishing white papers and check us out on dokanish.com.
Thank you very much, Nate, and thank you for everybody who attended.